Company vs. 2, every weapon and unit have a set of statistics that govern exactly how effective they are in combat. We often see these statistics tweaked when there's a new patch to the game, but very few of us actually understand what the statistics mean. Today I'd like to dive into these stats in more depth so that you can understand exactly how your units function, and also what changes are being made in future patches. First of all, let's talk about where you can actually find these stats that I'm talking about. The best source is probably Serealia, which is very easy to use and quite complete. However, it is missing a few units and is a little bit outdated. The next is Stein's stat sheet, which is also quite complete, but still a little bit outdated. You can also use the official CoH2 mod tools. CoH2.org has a great guide about how to use those. For patch notes, you can go to CoH2.org, where they have a complete list of all of the game's patch notes to date. I will include links to all of these sources in the video description. Unit stats are the stats of the actual models themselves, not their weapons. Infantry have target size, sight, health, and total pop, while vehicles have the same stats, plus also speed, acceleration, rotation, and armor. Let's go to Serealia to take a look at an example of infantry unit stats. Today we're going to focus on the Wehrmacht Pioneers. The unit stats are this first line of information, and Serealia includes information from both unvetted and also Vet 3 units. The most obvious stat here is total pop, which is the amount of population that the unit takes up when it's at full strength. The next stat is target size. Basically with this stat, the lower the better, and most infantry have around 1, some have slightly lower, and elite infantry can have significantly lower target sizes, which make them harder to hit. I'll explain exactly how this works later in the video. The next one is sight, which is pretty self-explanatory. The Pioneers have 42 sight, which allows them to see 42 distance away from them, as you can see here on this test range. This is slightly better than average, as most mainline infantry have 35 sight. The last stat is health, which for whatever reason Serealia does not include for most infantry, but all infantry in the game have 80 health. The only exception to this is the sniper, which has 82 health. Now let's move on to vehicles. For example, we're going to look at the OKW Panzer IV. Population, target size, and sight all function the same way that they do for infantry. As you would expect though, with tanks we have a much larger target size, in this case 20, as opposed to the average of 1 for infantry. Speed is the maximum amount of distance that the tank can travel in 1 second, and acceleration is how much the tank can accelerate in 1 second. Rotation is how many degrees the hull of the tank can turn in 1 second. Armor has 2 numbers. The first is the armor at the front of the tank, and the second is the armor at the back of the tank. We'll get into exactly how armor works a little bit later, but obviously the higher the number, the stronger the armor. That's all you need to know about unit stats. Now let's move on to weapon stats. These can be extremely overwhelming at first glance, but you really only need to understand a few of these key stats to understand what the weapon is capable of. In the rest of the video, I'm going to cover the 10 stats I consider to be most important to understanding each weapon. These are range, accuracy, damage, cooldown, reload, burst, penetration, area of effect, moving multiplier, and cover multiplier. First of all, there are 4 different types of weapons, all of which have slightly different characteristics and statistics. The first type is ballistic weapons, which are things like AT weapons, and tank turrets. Next are explosive weapons, which are things like grenades, mines, rocket artillery, and regular artillery. Then we have flame weapons, which are flamethrowers, flame grenades, and also flame tanks. Lastly, we have small arms, which are basically rifles, pistols, machine guns, and submachine guns. To illustrate the first stats here, I'm going to look at the US Rifleman's M1 Garand, which is the generic rifle that they spawn with. We're first going to investigate the range statistics, which can be found under the basic category in Serealia. Most weapons have 3 ranges, near, medium, and far, although some might have only 1 or 2. For the M1 Garand, near is between 0 and 6 meters, mid is 6 to 16, and far is 16 to 35. The maximum range is 35 and it cannot fire any further than this. These ranges are important because they determine, among other things, the accuracy of the weapon. In order to understand what these accuracy numbers mean, we need to understand the formula that the game uses to determine if a hit is scored or not. The basic formula, before we consider any modifiers, is simply the weapon's accuracy at the specific range times the opponent's target size. In the case of this rifleman with his M1 Garand shooting at a grenadier, he has a .5175 accuracy at maximum range, and the grenadier has a target size of .91. This gives us .471, which you should read as a percentage, meaning we have a 47.1% chance of hitting. Several things in the game, though, can add modifiers to this formula. For example, shooting at units in heavy or light cover reduces your accuracy by 50%, while shooting at infantry in negative cover actually makes it easier to hit. Each weapon also has its own moving accuracy modifier. In this case, the M1 Garand has a .6 moving accuracy, meaning it's only 60% as accurate while firing on the move. Once we actually score a hit, the amount of damage we do is determined by the weapon's damage stat. In this case, the M1 Garand does 8 damage per shot. This means it'll take 10 hits to kill a normal infantryman who has 80 health. There are also damage modifiers, though. For example, heavy cover and garrisons reduce damage for most weapons by 50%, whereas negative cover increases damage by 25%. Flamethrowers are a notable exception to this, as they actually do extra damage to units that are in heavy cover or buildings, and get no benefit from units that are in negative cover. For the next stats that I want to explain, we're going to use the Stern Pioneer SDG-44 as an example. For some reason, Serealia is listed as the MP-44. Let's take a look at the various burst statistics. First of all, only automatic weapons have burst statistics. This means the M1 Garand, which we just saw, does not have these stats. Instead of firing a single shot like most rifles do, weapons with burst will fire several shots in rapid succession. The burst rate of fire is the number of shots fired in 1 second of burst. To get the total number of shots fired per burst, we have to multiply the burst rate of fire by the burst duration. For each range bracket, there is a minimum and a maximum burst duration. For example, the SG-44 will fire a random amount of time between 0.13 and 0.22 seconds at far range. This usually allows it to get 2 shots off per burst. When firing at close range, however, the burst duration is much longer, allowing the SG-44 to get more shots off and do much more damage. Some longer range automatic weapons, such as the Obersoldaten MG34, have radically different burst profiles, which strongly favor engagements at long range. The next stat we're going to look at is cooldown time. Cooldown, not to be confused with reload, is the amount of time between each shot, or in the case of automatic weapons, between each burst. Cooldown, just like accuracy and burst, are also dependent on the range that you're firing at. As we see here, the SCG-44 has much faster cooldown times at close ranges than it does at far ranges. Furthermore, both cooldown and burst have moving modifiers. In the case of the SCG-44, this means the burst duration will be much shorter, only 37.5% of the non-moving burst duration. Cooldown, however, is also greatly reduced, only 25% of its non-moving counterpart. This means that the time between bursts will be reduced massively. To wrap up the SCG-44, I want to talk about reload. Reload duration, as you would guess, is the amount of time it takes to reload the weapon. In the case of the SCG-44, this is a random number between 2.8 and 3.5 seconds. Reload frequency is the number of cooldowns after which the weapon will reload. In the case of the SCG-44, the minimum and the maximum reload frequencies are different, which means sometimes the SCG-44 will reload after 5 cooldowns, and sometimes it'll reload after 6 cooldowns. This seems to be completely random. For the last few weapon stats, we're going to look at the British Comet tank's 17-pounder main gun. We're going to look at the weapon's penetration statistics and find out what this means when firing an armor. The formula to determine if a weapon penetrates after a hit is scored is the penetration value of the weapon divided by the target's armor value. In this case, the Comet's penetration value at long range is 170, and the Panther's frontal armor is 260. This gives us 0.654, which again we should read as a percentile, 65.4% chance of penetration. If the weapon's penetration is higher than the armor of the vehicle, it means that it will always penetrate, such as the case with the rear armor of the Panther. The last statistic I want to talk about is area of effect, or AoE. All explosive and ballistic weapons have an area of effect. The AoE radius is the maximum distance away from the shot where damage will still be dealt. The damage against the model will decrease the further away the model is standing from the blast. The exact damage is defined by the distance and damage stats. One useful stat is the 80 damage distance. 80 damage is the exact amount of health that an infantryman has, so this is the maximum distance from which an infantryman will be instantly killed. In the case of the Comet, this is exactly 0.96 away from the original blast. First of all, I want to say thank you all for bearing with me through this very long video. I know there's a lot of information, and I hope that it helps you in some way understand your weapons and units a little bit better. Unfortunately, in this one video, I was only able to cover the most important stats, and hopefully in the near future I'll be able to do a follow-up video and cover some more. And finally, I'd like to give a huge shout out to Victor Stewart at CoH2.org, whose posts and research make this video possible.